So the Nile River was seen by the Egyptians as the center of the world and life itself, while the flower was symbolic of life itself, while the Nile River itself is also in the shape of the lotus flower. It's just a profoundly deep thing, right? So where are these vases coming from? Because these appear in Crete and in the late Bronze Age Greek world, about just under 1,000 years after the time they disappear from the archaeological record in Egypt. So I found that compelling. Like, okay, so maybe obvious answer is these are treasured artifacts in the Egyptian world that they're using as gifts to give to, neighboring cultures. I don't know how they end up there. But the next thing I thought was interesting is that the Minoans thought that these were so amazing that they try to recreate them in their own local stone. Now the Minoans, I may have it up here. Yeah. So they're limited to their local stones, which is serpentine, alabaster, limestone, and soapstone. And here are a few, but there are many, 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 many more that exist of these specimens of the Minoans trying to recreate these vases out of their own local stone. And I found this very interesting. And so I just kept looking into it. Okay, well, what is the relationship between the Egyptians and the Minoans? Clearly, there's something going on here. And clearly, the Minoans are fascinated by the Egyptians. And so this is where it gets really, really dense. Starting off on a couple side points. Right around...
So just before you go into that, there's no hard stones then that they weren't able to they didn't have access to hard stones to be able to recreate them in hard stone?
That's right. Yeah.
Okay.
They're I mean, maybe there is granite and diorite on the island of Crete. I would imagine that there is, but the Minoans weren't using it. Yeah, they didn't have the tools or the expertise to be able to craft these out of them. So these are made out of stones that are half as hard or soft. So these are specimens that are created by the Minoans. So I started researching the relationship between the Minoans and the Egyptians. Clearly there is one. So the Nile River was seen by the Egyptians as the center of the world and life itself, while the flower was symbolic of life itself, while the Nile River itself is also in the shape of the lotus flower. It's just a profoundly deep thing, right? But clearly the Minoans are taking these things home with them, and they're fascinated by them. And there's so much more that I could go on with how Egyptian and Minoan culture can be connected, but I think everybody watching here thinks it's pretty obvious. Ryan, if you go to that Lotus vase, this is something I found really interesting when I was going through them, this is the most famous specimen, but I've seen at least 4 or 5 others of these Minoan bowls. This is made out of locally sourced serpentine stone from Crete. So this was not made in Egypt and brought back to Crete. This is they think anywhere from 1700 to 1450 BC. And what it is it's thought that this is a mortar and pestle bowl that has the Egyptian lotus leaves on the side of it. And this was the inception of this fascination I've had with this lotus flower. Like, what is the purpose of this flower? And why are they depicting it on this stone? Because it's very much a Greek thing to be... Okay, so the Egyptians, let's look at these vases. This is like the Apple of the ancient world, right? Apple is very sleek, very elegant, very minimalistic, very subtle. And the Egyptians are very subtle people. You go from pre-dynastic Egypt with these vases. You look at vases later on in Egyptian history. They're all very minimalistic and subtle. You look at Egyptian tomb wall art. It's very stoic. It's very eternal. It's not overly flamboyant. They're just these subtle, minimalistic people who their whole purpose in life is reaching for eternity. Everything about Egypt is eternal. Look at their statues. They're standing like this. Sometimes they're striding forward. It's this eternity that they're evoking and reaching towards. And even Greek philosophers identified that as well. That's what the Egyptian mindset was. But the Greeks the Minoans as well. If you go look at Minoan wall art or murals, it's very much them taking place, picking flowers or participating in parties or jumping over bulls or hanging out together. It's very Greek. And even the Greeks later on kind of go back and embrace this, glorifying the beauty of their life in the now, if that makes sense. And so when you look at Greek pottery later on during the classical period, the pottery, sometimes the pots will show you what is being used, like if they're drinking wine out of this vase or whatever, they'll have a depiction of a symposium around the vase and people are hanging out and drinking wine. It's like sometimes the Greeks will just display on a vessel what the vessel is used for, right? And so I looked at this and I was like, okay, is that the Minoans literally showing us that this is a mortar and pestle bowl used for grinding up the lotus flower to be used in something? And this is where this fascination began for me. And the more I looked into it, the more I realized how polarizing that area of research is. Because the big mystery here is that the ancient Egyptian lotus flower does not exist anymore. They used them so much and they were so popular that they went completely extinct.
Wow.
Now we have modern lotus flowers. The Maya had a blue lotus flower. Now there's a difference between the blue water lily and the lotus flower. The water lily is a lily. The lotus flower is a lotus flower, and they're completely different, but they look so similar. But the lotus flower does not exist anymore in Egypt. You also have them in India, and you have them maybe in Japan, and then in Mexico and in Egypt. Those are the places on the world that they're grown. But the species are all slightly different. The Egyptian lotus flower was its own unique thing that doesn't exist anymore. We have evidence of them, though, organic evidence, because they will be essentially mummified and stored in a tomb. And then you can go find like the crusted up petals of a lotus flower, and then they put them in like the little glass display, and they're kept in laboratories where they can be examined. And the last time I know that one was examined is maybe in the 90s, and they compared it to the modern day lotus flower. I don't know where this modern day lotus flower came from, either in the Americas or India, but there was like a 15% difference in the DNA of the flowers, and it was something about that 15% difference that actually would. I wish I could explain the chemicals behind it, but that 15% difference was a drastic difference. So anyways, the research that we know as far as what the Egyptians were using the lotus flower for is numerous and bountiful, but yet scant and hard to interpret. So all around ancient Egypt, man. Ryan, I sent you some photos of it's not in this folder, but in the other one. All around Egypt, dude. When you go, just look for the lotus flower. You're gonna see it everywhere. So I think that this is in the Temple of Seti. This is outside the Osirion. Okay, so there's lotus flower too. So you see the lotus flower at the top of these. You see them open and closed. So do you see? Right here at the bottom in the middle, you see that closed lotus flower column, and to the left of that, you see the open lotus flower column. So you see these columns everywhere, and the column is like, look at the column itself as the stem of the flower, and it's blooming up into the temple ceiling. Now, a lot of temple ceilings, it's the night sky, and so part of me wonders if I've wondered, just from coming from the Maya world, and in the Maya world, everything is so symbolic and so deeply meaningful, and there's nothing that's wasted space. Everything is conveying a message to you. When I was in Egypt and I was talking about these columns, there was an Egyptologist there, and I was explaining to her, some of my expertise comes from studying Latin America, where everything is so symbolic and deep and everything has a meaning. What do you think behind that? And then she told me, she was like, don't Mayanize this, just appreciate it. And I was like, are you kidding?
I'm not much of a thinker. Translation.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And so I had thought that surely there is some kind of deep meaning behind the columns the top of the columns either being a closed or a blooming lotus flower. And then the column itself is essentially symbolic of the stem of the flower, or sometimes it's symbolic of like a wrapping of different offerings. And like you can see on this closed one, they're wrapped together. Okay, so on the left, that comes from the Temple of Seti, just outside the Osirion. And all around the Egyptian world, you're going to see these offering scenes where it's the pharaoh giving an offering to Amun or whatever god is in front of him. And on that offering, there's going to be this little stand. There's going to be a vase of some kind, and then it's going to be the lotus flower. You'll have one that's open. You'll have two that are closed, and sometimes there'll be a papyrus flower there as well. Sometimes they're either draped over the vase or they're coming out of the vase, and you're going to see this everywhere, all over the Egyptian world. And so one of the polarizing things is the interpretation of, well, what is this flower being used for? What is it being used for? Well, we found these pornographic images before, where you see people performing, all kinds of interesting and complicated positions, and they're all sniffing of the lotus flower. They've got the lotus flower coming off the top of their head. They're using the lotus flower in these parties, and so one of the interpretations here has been, and the research has shown from using the lotus flowers and the chemicals that are in them. Ryan, wow, you pulled that up fast. Holy crap.
Yeah, he already had this one. Ryan already had that.
Okay.
Yeah. I was just messing with you, Ryan.
Yeah,
wow.
So that's funny. Okay, so go to my paper, Ryan.
I don't think we can show that on the final broadcast, by the way. We might have to blur some things out. But
hey, man, art is art. Wow, that's okay. Yep.
So I think you'll really love when I get to the end of painting this picture. This is a deeply profound element of Egyptian society that I've never seen anybody talk about, but it takes a little while to build up to it. All right, so Blue Lotus effects, if you go to that. So this is like a synthesized, hyper simplistic version of the paper that I'm writing.
We didn't build that up. We just jumped right in with that.
Yeah, I know. Sorry. No foreplay on that. We went straight to it.
Right. Right.
All right. So the most definitive ancient use is that it's agreed widely to have been used during religious rituals and sexual enhancement because of the presence of apomorphine. That's what I wanted to get at. So apomorphine is something that is used in modern day Viagra. And there was a research team that was working in Egypt in the late 90s, and they produced this documentary that I named my paper after. It's aptly called The Flower That Seduced Egypt. And basically at the end of this research, they deduced that the thing that they can find the best evidence for right now, technology is much more limited 30 years ago than today, and nobody's picked this research up since then. Is the most definitive thing that they can find evidence for that the Egyptians could have been using it for is sexual enhancement and like vigor, right? And I found that really interesting. But they also hypothesized the idea that it could have been used. There's elements about the flower that could be used for like preserving youth and health. But also the psychedelic aspects of it it's a fact that the fruit of the so the fruit of the lotus flower, it's a fact that the chemical that produces, when consumed in a moderate amount, whether you're distilling it in and you can in the leaves as well, but also the fruit, if you distill it and age it and put it in wine, which wine would have been consumed in Greece. Also in Egypt, but in Egypt they're also brewing beer. If you smoke it in moderate amounts, it will have a mild psychedelic effect. It'll be like if you took a couple puffs of a blunt or something like that. You'd get this kind of soothing feeling. You'd feel a little bit better. And then it consumed in high amounts, like with anything, it's going to have a profound effect. It's going to have a strong effect. Probably similar, what I've seen it described as is it would probably be more similar to or consuming cannabis. but there's an ancient source that attests to this. And it says, so I'm just going to read this verbatim. So Odysseus visits the land of lotus eaters. This is in the Odyssey, written by Homer in the Dark Ages, probably somewhere around 800 BC, likely the island of Jerba off the coast of Tunisia. So this is Odysseus speaking here, but Homer writing. He says, they started at once and went out among the lotus eaters. Now, this is his expedition around the Mediterranean, trying to get back home to his family in Greece. So they started at once. They went about among the lotus eaters, who did them no hurt, but gave them to eat the lotus, which was so delicious that those who ate of it left off caring about home and did not even want to go back and say what happened to them, but were for staying and munching on lotus with the lotus eaters without thinking further of their return. Nevertheless, though they wept bitterly, I forced them back into the ships and made them fast under the benches. Then I told the rest to go on board at once, lest any of them should taste of the lotus and leave off wanting to go home. So they took their places and smote the gray sea with their oars. So he visits the land of the lotus eaters. And basically what it's saying here is that whoever was eating the fruit of the lotus, which is at the core of the lotus flower. The lotus flower does not grow in Tunisia. It grows on the Nile. Whoever was eating of that enjoyed it so much that they just stopped caring about anything, right? It's kind of like the stigma that we have against like potheads. Like, you smoke weed all the time, you're just not going to care about anything. You start doing drugs, you're not going to care about anything. So there's a lot of people who interpret this as, oh, okay, this is not just like they're eating zebra cakes and they're getting fat and just enjoying it and they don't want to go anywhere because it's so delicious. This is having some kind of effect on them that is affecting their, psychedelic state and making them not care about going home, which was the whole mission that they're on, is trying to get back to Western Greece. And so I found this really interesting, and I thought, okay, is there any archaeological evidence that we can attest to that the lotus would actually be in Tunisia or on the coast of Tunisia? Well, yes, Phoenician trade routes. The Phoenicians around this period, this is the late Bronze Age, that the Odyssey takes place. There are Phoenician trade routes going all around the Mediterranean, and so you have Phoenicians that may be stopping in the Nile Delta where the lotus grows in abundance, acquiring these lotus and then going around on their trade routes. And so is this some very scant only remaining evidence of the fact that the lotus was a hot commodity, not only in Egypt, where it's clearly being consumed in abundance because it's on every single temple wall, in every tomb wall, everywhere, but also it's popular in the Mediterranean. So there's something really profound about this flower. So I say trade routes connecting ancient Tunisia to Egypt through Phoenician trade routes are well established. Could bundles of the Egyptian lotus have been a regular trade item? ? I say by the 5th century BC, the Greek traveler Herodotus was certain that the lotus eaters still existed off the east coast of Libya near Egypt. So that's really interesting. So it's almost 1,000 years later. Is there anything below that, Ryan? Oh, wow. Okay. So Herodotus says, a promontory jutting out into the sea from the country of the Jindanis is inhabited by the lotus eaters, who live entirely on the fruit of the lotus tree. The lotus fruit is about the size of the lentisk berry and in sweetness resembles the date. The lotus eaters even succeed in obtaining it from a sort of wine. So there. It's the lotus being mixed and aged into the wine and being consumed that way, and clearly having some kind of profound effect on them. That's why they're so famous.
So the lotus flower then went completely gone in Egypt, so it's not there today. And so what we're talking about is how they would have used it back in the day prior to it going away, whether or not they eradicated it, whether or not they made a decision to actually go in and pull up every plant to get rid of these lotus eaters and to get rid of this quote unquote drug, or whether or not they just got high off their supply and ran out, is, I guess, kind of an unknown.
That's
probably,
an unknown. Yeah,
right?
Absolutely.
So there's that, but then there's also lotus flowers that exist in different parts of the world, which you mentioned, and so those lotus flowers, though, from a DNA standpoint, are 15+% different than these lotus flowers. Are the lotus flowers that exist today, can those be used as drugs?
Yes.
They can. They can.
They can be. But the limited research that's been done is that they're even more mild. They think it'd be even more mild than the ones that were on the Nile.
Okay. Got it. So we really don't know the extent of how of the effects of the lotus flower, of what it had on the lotus eaters and on the Egyptian people themselves.
No.
Okay.
Yeah. So
that's crazy, by the way. This is crazy.
Yeah. So
it's really cool.
So we have scant evidence all the way around, but highly likely that the chemicals that are in the lotus flower, people were using it to get horny. They're using it in these sex parties. They're using it as like a sexual stimulant. And that the people off the coast of Tunisia that Odysseus met, according to the story, it was having some kind of effect on them that was making them not care about anything. So it has this sort of multi-purpose thing. Also, the researchers in the 90s proposed that it had properties that would help preserve your youthfulness. And there's another source that attests to this. I think that's probably worth bringing up right now. Okay, so Ryan, I sent you a photo that it's a little bit blurry, and it's some hieroglyphs that are on a temple wall. There's no lotus flower actually depicted in the photo. There you go. All right, so this is on a Ptolemaic temple. I believe it is the Temple of Edfu, and there's a British archaeologist who translated this, and essentially one part that we're taking from this is I believe it's Ptolemy the 10th. This is a Greek pharaoh ruling during the Greek dynasties. So you have the Ptolemaic dynasties, which is the last chapter. I believe this goes from let's start with Alexander. So 332 to 30 BC. So about 302 years of this dynasty. It begins with Alexander. It ends with Cleopatra's death. This is Ptolemy the 10th, I believe. That's his hand. He's holding this.
Got a funky hand.
Holding this scepter. Yeah. Greek Egyptian art gets real funky. Like they have these pudgy like spaghetti arms and then like the real elegant Old Kingdom and Middle Kingdom Egyptian artwork, wall art is completely gone. It's like this weird phase, and the hieroglyphs get very, very complicated. But we get a really interesting anecdote here, where on this wall, Ptolemy says he's essentially he's giving an offering of the lotus flower to the god Amun, and he tells Amun, he's like describing the experience of the lotus flower, and he says when you take of the lotus flower and when you sniff of it, you take of it, your mind expands and your eyes become imbued with dynamic properties. That's the direct translation. And then it goes on to talk about like the holy aspects of the flower. And I was like, your mind expands and your eyes become imbued with dynamic properties. Wow. So we're having it. It's affecting the psychological state. It's affecting, clearly, when you're high, you get a little bit loopy. And then it also has this vigor aspect to it. So it's making you like sexually strong. It's having the psychological effect on you. It's having a visual effect on you as well. This is like a drug that's doing quite a lot. And then it got even deeper. Ryan, if you'd go back to my paper.
It seems like science should be able to bring this back.
Ah, man, I know, right?
We ought to be able to mess around and really see what was going on.
Okay, so Egypt and the lotus. Let's go back 12,000 years to the first Egyptians that are arriving, that we know of, that are arriving in the Dakhla Oasis. They're migrating in from the Greater Sahara. The Sahara is drying up. People are moving to the Mediterranean coast. They're moving to the Atlantic coast. They're moving down into the Congo or in the savannas today. They only have a few options. But there's also this option of this really fertile yet congested Nile Valley off to the east. And so, anywhere from 12,000 years ago to just 6,000 years ago, people are moving into the Nile. And this is probably worth touching on. This is why the deeper I've gotten into this, the more I think like, okay, there's an interesting argument here that I've never seen an academic make. These are ideas that I've come up with myself. It's kind of like, I look at ancient Egypt like New York City. You have this huge influx of people arriving in this new land. You have New York City, which for whatever reason is this limited amount of space where everything is happening. And something like that, with all that energy and all that investment, is either destined to fall or it's destined to be greatness, right? The Nile is sort of similar to that. As the Sahara is drying up, you have all these people who are pushed into this small, compacted area. You can't have miles and miles and miles to take your cattle around and feed it all this random grass and set up camp everywhere and just, live off of the land. You have to form a sedentary lifestyle, and people are packed on top of each other. So that's either destined to fail miserably or be an enormous success. Maybe a success so great in such a fertile place that it creates a civilization that's powerful enough to create the world's largest structures before human history and other civilizations are even doing anything. They're all, around the ancient world, everybody else, for the most part, are still cavemen when the pyramids are being built at the pyramid's youngest date, And so I just find that fascinating. But so you have Egyptians arriving in Egypt, and one of the first things that they would notice as they're going down to the Nile all throughout the day is they would have noticed this flower. So I write, the Egyptian blue lotus rises from the depths of the Nile, blooms to worship the sun, and descends back into the river every single day. That flower emerges from the primordial water to worship the sun and then goes back under every single day. There's something divine about that separates itself from all the other plant species that these ancient people would have ever noticed. So they would have seen something divine about this. I was talking to Ryan about this last night. This is the pious chapter of human history where, when we were talking about, I see when people talk about vases, what is the common saying that some people use when they say, the precision indicates purpose or there's something.
Yeah, function.
The precision indicates function. Well, the only issue that I would take with that is in the 5th century BC.
Or the tool that was used to create it a lot of times.
Sure.
Say, yeah.
So the only issue I would take with that is we're dealing with a different chapter in humanity going back this far. And it's really at the 5th century BC when the Greek philosophers like Socrates, he starts telling the people, telling all the young people around the Agora, if the Greek gods really do exist, they're far away. I don't even know if they exist, honestly. But here's what I do know. Here's how we can control our lives and make our lives better in this day. The Athenian court did not like that at all. That is the age when the first domino gets pushed down, and we start getting towards this Western mindset of function, right? Like before ancient Greece, gears didn't exist. Gears are a very Western. Have the lotus up to their nose, or when they have the lotus blooming hanging over their head, it means up. You can only live along the Nile. That's this, 500-yard strip of land on the east, 500-yard strip of land on the west. That's this incredibly fertile oasis. We have this idea of Egyptians living in the desert. They didn't live in the desert. They lived in the fertile oasis on the green Nile, right, walking on grass every single day.
Right.
These were filthy, filthy rich people.
Yeah.
So they would have noticed this sacred cycle of this blue lotus going up and down. And this lotus becomes basically the central image of Egyptian society. It's on all of their columns. It becomes the very symbol of life itself in ancient Egypt. It's symbolic of life. There's an interpretation that sometimes when they have the lotus up to their nose, or when they have the lotus blooming hanging over their head, it means the person's alive. But when the lotus is hanging over their head and it's closed, it means that the person has died. It seems like the lotus permeates all aspects of Egyptian society, and it has multiple effects on you when you consume it, maybe depending on how you consume it as well. And it's like this wonder drug. And it has a sacred element about it where it rises every single day to worship the sun. The Egyptians are a sun-worshiping cult. That's what they do. That's why all their tombs are on the west side of the Nile, because the sun is born in the east and it dies in the west. So, the saying that we have when people die, when they say, oh, they've gone west, well, we get that from the Egyptians. So they're a sun-worshiping culture. Everything is about the sun for the Egyptians, and they're watching this flower worship the sun too. And then the flower becomes the very symbol of life, death, resurrection, okay? Ryan, pull up a satellite image of Egypt. This is the part where it gets spooky. Is the very makeup of the part of Egypt that is alive is in the shape of a lotus flower.
Yeah, that's cool.
How much more fitting could it be?
Yeah.
And in the Nile Delta, where that flower is blooming, that's where all of the lotus flowers grew in abundance.
Really?
Was in that delta.
Wow.
So the Nile itself, and
You see it immediately.
you
when
see it
pull this
immediately.
photo.
The Nile itself is the single most unique makeup of a country in the entire world. And it is symbolic. Not only is the flower itself symbolic of ancient Egypt, is the symbol of Egypt that the Egyptians used to identify themselves. They may not even have realized, but it was by some divine appointment that the landscape itself is in the shape of a flower. And that flower blooms out into the Mediterranean. And all of these cultures around the Mediterranean are influenced by this culture. You know, it's this, you know, I would be very slow to ever say that I think that the Egyptians knew the shape of their land. Although, you know, maybe they did, but if they mapped it all out and understood, but you know, they probably didn't see it from the satellite image. But it's one of these things that makes me think like, whoa, is there a divine aspect of this? Like,
I bet they did, man.
Some kind of cosmic divine aspect that their land is in the makeup of the flower. The flower is the single most important central key to their civilization. You know, it's this profoundly deep mystery here that I've never seen anybody talk about.
That's cool.
But so this is if you go back to the paper.
I mean, I've got a vase that has the Eye of the Sahara scratched into it. I mean, so if they like, was that based off of the Richat structure? You know, I mean, could very easily be a very similar thing.
Yeah.
If they're mapping out one, they're mapping out the other. I'm sure they knew. I mean, they obviously knew what. I'm sure they mapped it out. I guarantee.
Well, yeah, they certainly had maps. I just wonder. You know,
that's
we don't have
fascinating.
evidence of the map. Well, we have evidence of some maps, but not like of an entire, you know, their entire country or whatever. But so here we have next is shape of the Nile. So from satellite imagery, the Nile spreads out like the head of the lotus flower, growing out from a long stalk and blooming into the Mediterranean, just like their knowledge did. It bloomed out into the Mediterranean and thus spread to the rest of the world. So I put coincidence ? What is the likelihood that this flower that is unique to Egypt, the flower they depicted most by far on their temple and tomb walls, would also be reflected in the landscape of Egypt from space? Egypt is the single most unique country geographically on the entire planet. Next, we have gift of the Nile. The Greek traveler Herodotus, around 450 BC, famously wrote that the Egyptian civilization is a gift from the Nile. It was a unique and enormous oasis protected by monuments and deserts on both sides, continually fertilized by the black soil carried in from the river itself. So it's seasonally inundated. So the Nile River was seen by the Egyptians as the center of the world and life itself, while the flower was symbolic of life itself, while the Nile River itself is also in the shape of the lotus flower. It's just a profoundly deep thing, right? Hey guys, so this was a preview of my most recent podcast that I did on Matt Bell Limitless. We talk about everything from ancient South America, ancient Mexico, to my newly founded and never spoken about before theory that connects the ancient Egyptian lotus flower to potentially ancient psychedelics, ancient dreams, and even the Egyptian pre-dynastic hardstone vases. And then we get into talking about the foundation of Western civilization in ancient Greece. So if that sounds interesting to you, well then click the button somewhere up here or down in the description below.